Hi guys, it's Debbie and welcome to this year's first video in my What I Watched This Month series. Personally, 2020 was a huge year for me concerning the amount of content I watched. If we consider all the films, series and documentary I watched, the title count is at around 500. In some months I was watching around 70 titles or more. I did this because of course most of the time I used to spend outside had to be converted into solitary indoor activities, and I also had the chance to catch up with some films I just never had the physical time to watch. On a normal year, the quantity of films produced is astronomical, and I just never had the time to catch up with some older films, so I always had this huge gap in my movie knowledge. But I think I've now reached a good comfort zone. In January, I didn't watch too many films or series, mostly because I was taking a bit of a break, but I'll soon be back into watching more content, just maybe not my 6 films per day ratio as during the lockdown. Actually, this month I've been relaxing and taking a break by rewatching a comfort series for me, Criminal Minds. It wouldn't be too risky to say this is actually one of my favourite series of all time. I used to watch it on TV during high school, so that meant often missing episodes, skipping important plot elements, falling asleep halfway. So this month I decided to start rewatching it all the way from season 1. Criminal Minds is a crime drama series which focuses on a special FBI team, the Behavioural Analysis Unit, whose agents, contrary to popular belief, don't only track down serial killers but work on all a series of tough cases: bombers, kidnappings, heists, terrorist threats. They receive requests from law enforcement agencies which are usually struggling to identify a criminal, and the team uses all a series of techniques they specialise in, the most important one of which is profiling, so creating a profile of who they think the criminal could be. In general, they bring in all a series of different tactics, and of course, as all series, they are all the side stories of the agents, their friendships, personal lives and ways of approaching the cases. I've always enjoyed crime series like CSI, but I particularly like Criminal Minds for touching deeper and sometimes more uncomfortable topics. Now, let's get to everything else I watched. One of the films I really enjoyed watching this month was The Lost City of Zedd, which had been on my watch list for an incredibly long time. This movie is based on the true story of a British explorer who at the beginning of the 20th century was sent on a journey to the border between Bolivia and Brazil, basically in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. We must remember that at the time, many people in the West used to consider the local indigenous populations of the area as just savages, with no intellectual acuteness beyond hunting and building mud huts. Luckily, our protagonist was way more open-minded, and as a matter of fact, one of his goals during these journeys was to prove that in those areas there is much more than what meets the eye. The title of the film, The Lost City of Zedd, refers to his idea that in the middle of the forest they would find proof of civilizations which dated well before many Western ones. Just for reference, back at the time people didn't know of the existence of famous sites like Machu Picchu, so the film is a combination of both beautiful shots and incredible cinematography, great storytelling, but also all the implications of coming in contact with a local indigenous population and accepting the cultural differences. Another film I really enjoyed was I Saw the Devil, a Korean horror movie I would only recommend if you are mentally prepared for a storytelling which is straight out of your worst nightmare. It's the story of a serial killer who mostly attacks lonely women and does anything imaginable with them before and after their death. One of the victims happened to be engaged to an intelligence agent who vows to track down the killer and make him repay for his actions. This film is actually often recommended on lists of dark, gut-wrenching movies. So although I'm not going to say anything more about the plot to not spoil it, I would definitely recommend the movie. Then I watched a film called Precious, based on a book I had read many years ago as a teenager. Now the book was harsh and the film isn't much lighter, and although it's now not often spoken about, back at the time it was all across the film award scene. I think it was even nominated for 5 or 6 Oscars. Precious is the name of a high school girl living in poverty with her overpowering mother. She's 16, can't read or write, and she's at her 2nd pregnancy. She's been abused in every way possible. She's been taught to not trust any institution, if not to gain some financial benefit from it. Her mother has control over her, even forcing her to overeat. This film is pretty tough, but it also shows how some workers, for example teachers, can often spot odd behaviours, strange patterns which sometimes slip through the cracks of the system. I then watched Saturday Night Fever. Believe me or not, I had never seen this film, although I'm a huge fan of all the track list. This film is based on 70s disco music and the disco culture of the time. John Travolta portrays a popular and ambitious dancer who feels suffocated by the idea of a regular, monotonous lifestyle and aspires to make something out of his dance skills. He also comes from a religious, traditional Italian-American household which doesn't particularly appreciate these choices. Although this film features some of the most recognisable shots of all time, what I didn't know is that the characters aren't always portrayed in a completely positive light. Even John Travolta's protagonist was hard to empathise with in some scenes. But as I always say, if a character is actually making you feel something, even a negative emotion, it means the film is actually conveying something, it's not bland. Anyway, there is actually a sequel to this film called Staying Alive, and although it has some pretty negative reviews, I'm kind of curious about it. I think I'm going to watch it. I then rewatched another old film, more or less from the same time, Airplane, which I have seen countless times and which never fails to make me laugh. I don't know how to explain this, but this film feels like one of those videos on early YouTube which would be just a mashup of random hilarious scenes, which taken singularly out of context wouldn't be funny, but when you're at the 10th one you just can't even catch your breath from how much you're laughing. The story is set on board an aeroplane as a parody of the disaster genre, and in general making fun of everybody and everything. There is actually even a scene referencing Saturday Night Fever. So various accidents happen on board and the passengers are trying to make it home safely, but of course the situations are absolutely chaotic. The passengers all represent very specific stereotyped figures. There is a lot of slapstick comedy and a ton of quick, random funny scenes. Rewatching it with my family, we realised that if you're not paying attention in every scene, you're going to miss something. Next up, I watched White Boy Rick, the true story of a kid who was involved in a huge situation of guns and drug dealing and the FBI wanting him as an informant and gangs, drug addiction, deciding what is best for your family and future, all at the ripe age of 14. The story behind this film is pretty interesting. I don't think I'd ever heard about it, but I must say I felt a bit torn while watching it. In some moments, the acting was terrific, especially on behalf of Matthew McConaughey, who portrays the father of this family crumbling from drug addiction and criminality and having to make the right choices. But in other moments, I felt a little lost in the plot. I never felt it was gripping me as much as it should have. It kind of felt like a missed opportunity to be more emotional and thought-provoking. Let me know if you've seen White Boy Rick and what you think about it. I then watched a documentary called American Factory about the establishment of a huge Chinese factory in a town in Ohio where the residents were struggling with the consequences of unemployment. It follows the story of the factory right from its foundation and then goes on to explore all a series of topics, especially the clash between the Chinese and American work ethic. For example, the commitment to a company, the trust or distrust towards unions, bringing up issues on the workplace or just accepting everything because it's a huge opportunity. It's a really interesting documentary because it shows how, after all, we are all the same all around the world, but at the same time, the environment in which we are brought up and the way we're used to working does affect our approach to various aspects of our life. I then watched a film which had me completely lost. Ava, I can't remember, starring Jessica Chastain as an assassin who's having some trouble in her line of work while also having to deal with addiction and trying to reconcile with her estranged family. Jessica Chastain was fine in the film. The problem was the whole background story, which, as I said on Instagram, feels like a third grader's scrapbook. There is no fluid continuity with good storytelling, just random scenes pasted together and actors just saying lines. For example, Chastain's character is carrying out her assigned missions, but of course there's something odd going on. Her missions are botched, she feels she is in danger and tries to figure out what's going on. But then suddenly she's chatting with her mother, and then suddenly it's a 15-minute segment with her bickering with people close to her, and then insert a random Colin Farrell and random scenes about addiction. None of it had decent cohesion. It never became that gripping thriller assassin story it wants to be. I then rewatched Tenet, the film I was most excited to see in 2020. I had rushed to the cinema the night it was released. There are actually multiple videos on Tenet and Christopher Nolan here on my channel. I will leave them linked. But summed up, without spoilers, Tenet is the story of people who are trying to stop something which is described as a third world war, something worse than a nuclear holocaust, and which has to do with the inversion of time, meaning elements in our environment moving opposite to the natural flow of the world. The two agents assigned to this mission are portrayed by John David Washington, the son of Denzel Washington, and Robert Pattinson, who again defies the idea of him still being the emo Twilight kid. Now, from a technical point of view, this film is very well made. It has huge sequences created with no computer-generated effects. They're great choreographed action scenes, a great cinematography, a cool soundtrack. The problem is that it is incredibly complicated. Now, all Chris Nolan films tend to be complicated. Think Inception, Interstellar, Memento, The Prestige. But even if you get lost in all the nitty-gritty science details, you can usually still follow the actual storyline. But in Tenet, if you lose 10 seconds of dialogue, you have no clue what is going on. It's all about entropy and physics, and not only the scientific consequences of the inversion of time, but also all the paradoxes, the moral and psychological consequences of tampering with the flow of time, free will and destiny and fate. I personally enjoyed it, but I can definitely see where all the criticism came from. But I always bring up the example of The Matrix. To actually fully understand what's going on, one should theoretically study all sorts of content, including old philosophical metaphors. So this month I decided to rewatch Tenet, armed with a notepad and a heavy hand on the pause button. It took me about 6 hours to watch it, and I think by the end I managed to understand most of it. But of course, we can't have that same experience in cinemas. Another film I watched this month is Brain on Fire, starring Chloe Grace Moretz. Now, this film has some pretty bad ratings, and to be honest, I agree with them. It's the true story of a young woman with a promising career as a journalist, but who suddenly starts to feel very ill, to the point of having seizures, hallucinating, losing consciousness, acting differently, losing a grip on reality, and the doctors are struggling to figure out what's going on, while this of course is affecting every aspect of her life. I personally think this film failed to convey the message of people misinterpreting or underestimating other people's illnesses, passing erratic behaviour off as just craziness, demonizing them for their struggles. It was mostly reduced to angry boss shouting at employee and necessary angry parent shouting at doctors for not having the solution trope. I don't really have much more to say about this film, I just wouldn't really recommend it. Then I was actually forgetting I watched Body of Lies, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, I've seen the majority of films with Leonardo DiCaprio, although there are a couple scratching at the back of my mind, reminding me that I still have to watch them, for example, Blood Diamond. But for some reason, this one had never really crossed my mind. Body of Lies is directed by Ridley Scott, and it focuses on the attempt to track and capture a dangerous terrorist. The lead CIA agent on the case is portrayed by DiCaprio, and he's struggling because tackling terrorists is a very delicate job, And at the same time, he feels like his superiors, who follow from a very safe distance, don't really have an idea of how the situation actually is and how to correctly move their pieces. It's a pretty good film. I then watched Penguin Highway, a particularly bizarre movie about penguins suddenly appearing in a small town, followed by progressively weird events, including Coca-Cola cans transforming into animals. Anyway, the characters decide to look more into this, and of course they uncover a huge adventure. I wish I could say I really enjoyed this movie, as it looks like something I would usually find fascinating, and although many moments I thought it was delightful in its weirdness, it never really captivated me the way I wished. I actually found a review which perfectly sums up my feelings about this film. A half memory of a strange but pleasant dream. The next film I watched was purely to satisfy my curiosity. Now, to give you some context about this film, as many of you know, I am a huge Donnie Darko fan. Actually, my first video ever on YouTube was a video about Donnie Darko, and just a couple of weeks ago it was the 20th anniversary of the film. Now, over the course of time, Donnie Darko became a cult movie. It's a weird, beautiful story of paradoxes and time travel and death, and a teenager who starts to have odd visions, which include a rabbit telling him the world is about to end. In the film, the protagonist has two sisters, including a younger one called Samantha, and somebody decided to make a sequel to Donnie Darko all about her called S. Darko. Now, this film is not canon. The director of Donnie Darko said he has never and will never have anything to do with this movie. I think we could all openly describe it as a purely fan movie with a very, very low budget. But I watched it as I'd kept my curiosity all these years. But well, I knew from the opening titles in Comic Sans that this film wasn't promising anything particularly good. This is nothing more than a fan movie, and I'm pleased for the people who actually made it, but it's nothing comparable to the original work. On the contrary, you can really tell it's trying to bring back the edgy, depressed mood, the sad and problematic teen protagonist, but it all ended up being very, very awkward. Basically, Samantha Darko is travelling with her rebellious friends, and they stop in a small town in the middle of nowhere where the usual odd events happen, weird visions, the rabbit is back again. It was just my curiosity. But now we have reached the last film on today's list, a beautiful animated film called In This Corner of the World, which basically describes the day-to-day life of a Japanese family at the height of the Second World War, which also included atomic bombs being dropped on major cities. What I think made me like this film so much is that, especially in the West, the mainstream media doesn't usually cover Japanese or in general Asian life stories during periods of war, if not under a Western point of view. So I loved seeing stories of regular people carrying out their regular day-to-day activities, traditional Japanese activities, but while also coming to terms with the fact that their country is at war. And apparently many of the characters, many of the stories described are actually based on real life stories. And with that, we have reached the end of today's list. I would love to hear what you've been watching, what you would recommend, what films you didn't like, what you think about the titles I watched. Let me know everything with a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.